So for those of you who are here tonight instead of in person last week, the nice thing about this evening is it's going to be a little bit longer. So I've added some slides, some additional information. And last time while we were at the beautiful Charleston Library Society, there really wasn't a chance to do any Q&A. So hopefully this will be a little bit more discussion oriented towards the end. So I want to begin with a little bit of introduction. Why this book? Where did the project come from? Because admittedly, Charleston is known as being a diverse place, sort of a maritime cosmopolitan city, but typically Italians aren't the first large demographic that comes to mind when you think of the Lowcountry or the South in general. And so when I first started this project, I knew I'd find information, but I was really shocked and excited by the volume of information I found and by the really diverse and interesting biographies we were able to uncover for about 300 years of Charleston's history. So I do want to mention who really is the impetus for this book, and that is the Dante Alighieri Society of Charleston. So I am a historian, a preservationist, and an Italian American, specifically a Sicilian American. So when I got the chance to work on this project, I was really excited just for my own personal history, even though, like Laura, I'm not originally from the South. Almost everybody in South Carolina, whether it was in 1670 or 2020, came from somewhere else. It's a colonial city. So hopefully, this is just the tip of the iceberg. The book is about 90-ish illustrated pages, but really anything that we talk about for 5 to 10 pages could be a dissertation unto itself. So one of my hopes with the book is that other local Italians and Italian Americans and students will get excited and pick up some of these topics, whether it's Italianate architecture or exploitation of Italians or, rags to riches stories, that they'll find little nuggets that they can sort of expand into additional bigger projects. So Dante Alighieri Society is an organization that's been around since 1889, and the Charleston chapter is one of the newer ones, but they are a really interesting and dynamic group of folks, both Italians and Italian Americans, and just new residents who are interested in learning more about Italy's culture. And one of the fun aspects of this project, looking at Italians in the Lowcountry, was realizing that Italian culture showed up on these shores actually before very many Italian immigrants arrived here. So my goal tonight is to run through a quick chronology of each of the main chapters or themes of the book, with the disclaimer that if you get a chance to pick up the book, whether you borrow it from the library or purchase a copy, there are some really fantastic interviews in the book. Some of those are interviews that I conducted with Italian Americans, but the last chapter of the book that we'll just summarize real quickly at the end is interviews with current Italians who reside in the city of Charleston. And I have to give credit, I think she's in attendance, I saw her pop up earlier, to Donatella Capoletti, who is one of the founders of the Dante Alighieri Society chapter in Charleston. And she is the genius who was able to track down all of the current dynamic, important Italians who live in the city. So I just wanted to give her credit where it's due for pulling together everything that allows us to bring this all the way up to 2021. So we will now jump in at the very beginning, part one, the colonial era. So I mentioned last time when I did this in person that we often think of Charleston or the Lowcountry or South Carolina in general as being a very English colony, because it was a proprietary colony owned by 8 English lords. And after that, it becomes a royal colony. So our identity in the colonial period is very English. But it's important to remember that the Charlestonians who came here, whether it was from Barbados or directly from England, what was all the rage in London in the 1670s, in the 1750s, was Georgian Palladian architecture, which, as the name indicates, is an obsession with all things Italian, and especially Italian Renaissance architecture. So in our colonial period, there actually was very few Italians who came here, but every Charlestonian who was anybody who wanted to show off their cultural knowledge and, most importantly, their architectural prowess, they were very interested in utilizing Palladian architecture. So most of the folks attending are probably familiar with Andrea Palladio, world famous Italian Renaissance architect. But a lot of his work became popular almost a century after his death in England, when a bunch of Neo-Palladians got his books, translated them into English, and did updated plates. So families like the Draytons with famous Drayton Hall, they're absolutely obsessed with classical proportion, Italian architecture and details. And sort of speaking to that, there also was a few, I think it's fair to say token, because there was not many, a few early Italians. And the ones who came by and large were coming here as tutors, either language tutors or music tutors for these important, wealthy, elite Charlestonians who, again, want to show off their cosmopolitan cultural knowledge. So as one quick example pulled out of a South Carolina Gazette, at the top of the screen, you can see Andrew Seary just arrived from England, but he basically came here to teach people how to speak and read Italian. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention one of the important biographical details for Dante Alighieri, whose society is what brought you this project here in Charleston in 2021, is that he was one of, actually the first writer to write poetry and do work in Italian vernacular language instead of only Latin. But Italians and English alike and French would have been very interested in all of these sort of cultural developments coming out of Italy. However, there were not many actual Italians coming here. And I do want to mention that there are some specific reasons for that. So last week, we had a great Italian American from New York who opened up the lecture by giving all kinds of good, hard statistics about how many Italians came and what parts of the country they arrived in. And really, the biggest influx into the United States is in what we in the South would call the postbellum era. So over 16 million Italians left Italy and Sicily and came to the United States in a 40-year time period. Literally almost a quarter of the people who lived in Italy left in this massive diaspora to the United States. There was actually not many Italians arriving in the colonial era, even in the North. And one of the main reasons for that is that there hadn't been as much political unrest. This is before the unification of Italy. Another key aspect of why we didn't have many in Charleston is that as an English colony, we play by English religious and political rules. So it actually was illegal to be a Catholic in colonial Charleston. And I think that's important to remember because our city gets this somewhat deserved, but somewhat not, reputation for early religious freedom. And one of the reasons for that is because almost every variety of Protestant was welcome here, and certain Jewish traditions. However, because England was regularly at war with papist or Catholic countries, there was a pretty deep-seated fear of Catholics in the Lowcountry. So Italians probably wouldn't have been interested in coming here in those early days anyway. But as I mentioned, their architectural prowess and their cultural prowess did arrive here in the Lowcountry. So two fun, quick visuals for that. This beautiful imported Italian marble on the left, his sort of textbook, high style Georgian Palladian architecture. This is located in the Miles Bruton House, which is a 1760s house. Begun in 1765. And even though that family is interested in all things English, their architecture very much reflects that interest in Italian imports and Italian balance and symmetry. And to give a quick mention of our hosts tonight, the Charleston Library Society, early Charlestonians absolutely did collect Palladio's works and Piranesi's works, which you see a plate of here on the screen on your right. So they would have had these, even in Italian language, in Latin, in their collections in the Lowcountry in the colonial era. And interestingly, we did have just a small, but sort of unique influx of Italians in the colonial period. Some of you have maybe heard of Perrysburg. This is a dead town that no longer exists. It's in the bottom of the state, close to what's now Savannah. But in our early colonial days, before Charlestonians have figured out how to make the most money the quickest, they tried pretty much everything. They tried growing olives here. They forested timber. Eventually, cotton and rice and indigo took off. But one of the fun experimental crops that brought us about 30 Italians was the attempt to grow groves of mulberries here, to try and cultivate silkworms to have a silk export. It didn't really take off, but it brought about 30 Italians, Protestant Italians, interestingly, from the Piedmont region of Italy here to the Lowcountry. And they lived in Savannah, in Charleston, and Perrysburg, and then left after about a decade and went back to Italy. But they were here, and they tried some of our most ambitious agricultural experimentation of the colonial period. So jumping forward, part two, next phase, the early republic. So entering into the federal era in the Lowcountry. And this is an important moment, maybe not for Italians in 1780, but one of the things that would make them feel welcome when they came in droves in the 1870s is the beginning of true religious freedom in South Carolina. So as soon as we become the state of South Carolina and there is an early republic and there's a constitution, that opens up the beginnings of the Catholic Church in the South. So the pictures on the screen are the interior and exterior of St. Mary's, our mother Catholic church over on Hazel Street. The building is post-fire of 1838. The original building was lost, but I wanted to point out a couple interesting features. Firstly, this is not a Gothic revival church, y'all. This is a very neoclassical, Italian proportioned, balanced church. And the interior has a ceiling done by an Italian artist named Chisola who came here in the 1890s. So while we never had enough Italians to have a completely Italian congregation, St. Mary's was the first and the only for a while and continued to be one of the most popular for Italians who moved to the Lowcountry. And another interesting tidbit is that allegedly the first legal Catholic mass ever given in South Carolina was given on a ship in the harbor in 1786 by an unnamed Italian priest. So I think that's kind of fun that even though Irish Catholics get a lot of credit for founding this church, there was some important Italians who were a part of that movement. And sort of in keeping with our colonial fascination with all things Italian, there was a wide group of wealthy Charlestonians who were very interested, again, all things European, trying to copy the Brits, in making grand tours to Europe. And of course, these are wealthy Charlestonians, Draytons, Middletons, Izzards, Smith family. But one of the biggest, most important steps of the Grand Tour was a chance to, of course, go to Rome and Naples and Florence, and not only see important ancient classical and Italian Renaissance buildings, but also to see Italian masterpieces in sculpture and oil paint. And some of those Charlestonians were wealthy enough to be able to purchase pretty important collections and ship them back to the Lowcountry. If anybody's interested in the Grand Tour and the material culture behind these trips to Italy, there's a few really good books by a historian named Maury McInnes, and she delves into the personal collections, both literary collections, but also artistic collections of some of these early Grand Tour explorers. And Joseph Allen Smith is probably one of the most predominant. Keeping in mind, y'all, this is pre-steamship, where a trip from Charleston to Europe would have taken weeks. And Smith liked Italy and actually spent almost a decade there. And sadly, some of his collection was lost, but he bought dozens of Italian masterpieces and shipped them back to South Carolina and Philadelphia. And they still make up the core of the Philadelphia Academy of Art's principal collection. Oh, and should have had a slide for this, but it popped into my mind and I thought it would be fun to mention. Some of these Lowcountry grand tours, or explorers, if you will, were some of the first Americans to get a chance to go and visit some of the excavations at Palmyra, where they were unearthing amazing Roman artifacts. And they were also some of the first to get a chance to see the excavations at Pompeii, which to English people in the 1780s wouldn't be that exciting. But for Americans, that was a pretty big deal to get a chance to make those cultural explorations. All right, so zooming forward into the antebellum era. This is where we start to get a small but sizable enough Italian population that we start to see certain businesses become dominated by Italians and certain small ethnic enclaves popping up in the Lowcountry. Keeping in mind, we never had enough, sadly, Italians here to have an Italian language newspaper. We never had enough to have a completely Italian congregation of Catholics that did, Italian language masses. But by the antebellum era, we have enough here in person that start to make their own footprint. But before we jump into some of those folks, I want to mention that cultural or architectural interest in all things Italian not only persists, but it picks up steam in the 1850s and again in the 1880s. And what you're looking at on the screen is one of our best examples in the city of Italianate architecture. This is the Patrick O'Donnell House on Lower King Street. Derogatorily called O'Donnell's Folly because he nearly bankrupted himself 3 times in the construction of this beautiful 1850s house. But again, when you think of Charleston, you probably typically think of English influence. The very black and white, literally and figuratively, dynamics of the Lowcountry. And when we think of architecture, we often think of Greek revival, big, massive columns. But that does a disservice to all the really well done, high style Italianate architecture. So O'Donnell's Folly is an 1850s building. And even though it's got classical details, O'Donnell, when he picked this style, he was very careful to use Italian traditions. So the columns on the house are Roman Doric, they're not Greek Doric. The segmental arches are of Roman extraction. And you see a lot of delicacy and curves inside and outside. And to zoom on to the interior, you can see there's no heavy post and lintel. Everything is done in kind of delicate arcading. Here's another great high style example. This is the Jenkins Michael house, also 1850s. So this house, to a random tourist taking a pedicab, they'd say, oh, look at that Greek mansion. This thing is textbook Italian Renaissance revival. Careful attention for every detail to either be of ancient Roman extraction or Italian Renaissance detail. Even the placement of the house on a podium with those steps that lead upward. So I think it's fun to think of Charlestonians self-consciously trying to make sure their architecture reflects their knowledge from their grand tours. Speaking of which, if you don't have lots of friends and connections south abroad to get into the O'Donnell house, any local Charlestonian can get a chance to see a small example of some of these grand tour collections if you go and take a tour of the Aiken Rat House. fantastic home on Elizabeth Street, owned and operated by Historic Charleston Foundation. And this house actually has a really interesting, air conditioned, the rest of the house is not, climate controlled art gallery. The Aikens spent 3 years abroad, most of that time in Florence, Rome, and Naples, and they collected so many pieces of art that they had to construct an extra room as an art gallery onto the side of their earlier building. And you can still see some of the pieces that they bought and shipped back with them, most of which having been recently restored and their frames restored as well. So you see those pieces when you go to the Aiken Rhett house hanging in pretty much the same frames they were in Italy when the family picked them out and purchased them. So what about regular Charlestonians? Interestingly, the first Italians who come here, again, not tons of them, but they start showing up in the 1840s and 1850s. They group themselves in specific parts of the city. And again, there's not enough of them to have a little Italy. But by and large, you can see this is an 1861 table from the city census. And this is all of the nativity of white males broken down by ward or district of Charleston. And you can see resoundingly, we have a pretty large native-born white population. And we have some English, and we have almost 2,000 Irish, which is a pretty good chunk of our city. Keeping in mind the population is about 30,000 in 1860. And there's only a whopping 45 Italian males. So not a lot, but they're all grouped in Ward 3. 26 of them. So what part of the city is that today? It's the market and it's Ansonboro, just south of the market. And so it turns out that most of our early Italians, they're either fishermen and mariners and dock workers. So they live in Ansonboro because it's close to the Cooper River, or they're fruit merchants and liquor wholesalers. So they live and work close to the market where their businesses are. So when we start to see enough Italians to really look at their permanent impact is in the postbellum era. So not only is Charleston and the South changing rapidly post 1865, but Italy is experiencing some major crises and changes as well. So of course, Charleston in this period transitions from slavery to freedom. And we can't understate the importance of that for low-country economy. Families like the Aikens no longer can make the grand tours and bring back all these amazing pieces of art, but no longer are they able to exploit slave labor. So there's actually a pretty creative and sometimes upsetting attempt to bring immigrants from somewhere else to take the jobs that formerly enslaved people don't want to do. And people in the Low Country thought of everything from Chinese to more Irish to the Italians. And it actually lines up upsettingly well with some of the changes that are occurring in Italy. So for those of you who are Italian American, if you've ever attempted to get dual citizenship, which I'm snails pacing my way through currently, if you're immigrants, your ancestors came here before 1861, it turns out you might not be eligible for Italian citizenship because Italy as a unified nation doesn't exist. It's separate kingdoms and principalities before that. So the unification leads to a lot of people movement and political change. Italy also has waves of really catastrophic earthquakes in the 1880s, 1890s, 1910s. And so that leads to a massive diaspora of 16 million Italians. So while not millions of them came to the Low Country, interestingly, the ones who came here were actively courted. So if you think about an immigrant coming in, whether they're Chinese, Japanese, Italian, Irish, Greek, usually you have a reason for choosing a place, whether it's a family member who blazed the trail and said, hey, come to Cleveland, there's work, in this part of the United States. Or perhaps there's some kind of crafty advertisement of jobs, of a labor market. So it turns out one of the first big industries to actively court Italians was the heavily exploitative phosphate mining industry. So for those of you not from the Lowcountry, if you're recent residents, phosphate mining took off in the 1860s and 1870s. And what it is people taking plantations that they can't really afford to farm because now you have to pay laborers, and they start trying to extract phosphate rock. And it's a junky rock you can't build out of, but you can pulverize it and mix it with guano and turn it into fertilizer. And it was the big boom in the postbellum era. It's a smelly, dangerous, dirty process. And so it turned out that some of the only people willing to do it were Italian immigrants who didn't have much other choice. So if you look at the little ad on the top left, this is from a Charleston newspaper. It says, wanted employment for 1,000 Italians on the phosphate lands. Those desiring such labor, please address N. Garbini, who has a business at 26 Market Street. So this is actually an Italian labor merchant, if you will, who had connections in New York. And he's basically trying to get a bunch of Italian laborers on the railroad here to the Lowcountry. So these would have been folks with no formal education, probably didn't speak proper Italian, probably spoke dialects, maybe weren't literate in any language, who are just looking for labor jobs. So they come to the Lowcountry by the thousands. Those folks would have been living outside of the city. There also was a little bit of a market for Italian farm labor, considering a lot of our families who left Sicily would have been peasant farmers. They come to the Lowcountry, it's hot here, they're doing similar work. But the ones who came to this city, just like those whopping 45 antebellum Italians, they group themselves into the market and into Anson Borough. So the cool little bird's eye map that you're looking at from 1872, which you can download for free from the Library of Congress, and it's great. I've picked out 2 red arrows. Those show you 2 new Catholic churches that popped up in Anson Borough, by and large because of this influx of postbellum Italians. Keeping in mind, St. Mary's is just 2 blocks away, but there are enough Italians and Irish to start creating new Catholic churches. The other big market the Italians cornered was fruit selling. And for me, this was really fun because it turned out a lot of my Sicilians in Cleveland had fruit stands, and 2 of them did all right and managed to buy brick and mortar stores. So I was really excited to see that parallel experience in the Lowcountry. And in doing some research for my people, and this should have been obvious to me, it's really cheap to get a push cart and go down to the market and buy a bunch of imported fruit, mark it up a couple cents, and peddle it around the city. And so the overhead for starting those businesses is pretty low. And after about 5 years of that, this is just a quick list of a few from one snapshot in time in this postbellum era. And all of these folks did well enough to start, if not 1, sometimes 2 brick and mortar stores. And you'll notice that I've tried to put the addresses for them. A lot of them are on Lower and Upper King, but you'll see these businesses literally everywhere, up in what's now the East Side, down in the French Quarter, and grouped in the market. So jumping forward, we could do a biography on every one of the folks that I just flew through on the last screen. But I want to mention just a few of the more famous Italian families that came here and left a pretty big cultural footprint at the turn of the 20th century. So the Cantinis, for Laura and Lisa, I added these guys. I didn't have them for the short version last time. The Cantini family were some interesting folks. So you can see a city directory listing for them, 1890s, and there are several of them. So a series of brothers came to the Lowcountry. This is the still standing historic house of a Cantini, which is how he usually shows up in the census. And what these folks made their money in, like many Italians, was groceries. They were importing Italian luxury goods, olive oil, fruits. They also were importing liquors and wines. And that's a pretty profitable business. And a lot of us know about the Prohibition story. So of course, I'm going to mention Vincent Chico in a minute. But this story is a little bit earlier. South Carolina, way before the United States had federal prohibition, we had state dispensary laws here, which meant only certain people with state licenses could sell alcohol. And if you were caught trying to sell it without a license, it was either a big fine or jail time. And G&A Cantini continuously managed to import wines and liquors, even during Prohibition, even during the dispensary laws. And they ran aground of one of the sheriffs who was just gunning for them. And the sheriff managed to get a warrant to invade Mr. Cantini's house that you see here on the screen. And he tried to resist and he said, no, it's not my business, it's my private residence. And finally he gave in. And they went into the house and they ripped a bunch of doors off of the hinges and they found hundreds of bottles of Italian imported wine. And they confiscated all of it. And Mr. Cantini went to court, tried 3 times, and eventually was successful in getting, they'd already sold and drank all of it, but he got $4,000, which is a lot of money in 1894, reimbursement for the government wrongly taking his alcohol, because it turns out if you had it for your personal consumption, it was legal. It was only illegal if you were trying to sell it. So, given a decade, you could go through a couple hundred bottles of wine yourself, I guess, in a Charleston summer. So interesting, crafty little family. And of course, we have to mention the Sottiles, arguably one of the most famous groups of Italians to come to the Lowcountry. And I do want to mention a lot of my images I'm about to show are courtesy of Nick Sotilli and the Sotilli reunion. So the family, of course, is still in the Lowcountry. And I'll mention just quickly a few of the Sotiles alive today, a little bit later in the PowerPoint. But I do want to mention the Sotilli Brothers. And this is one of their original advertisements. Nick Sotilli craftily photoshopped one of the Sotilli brothers into this, who was not in the original letterhead. So that's kind of cool. I thought he did a great job. You can't even tell. But anyway, there were multiple Sotilli brothers who came to the Lowcountry, and they were not necessarily poverty-stricken Italians like the phosphate miners. The Sotilli father, the patriarch, if you will, was a locksmith from Sicily. But what's fun about the Sotillis is that each of the brothers, the 5 who stayed, were just business magnates. Each one found their own interesting niche. And so I'm going to touch on just a couple of them because they could have their own hour-long PowerPoint left to my own devices. But I want to mention Santo Sotilli. The little photograph you see of him here, I have to mention this source because when you first look at it, I realized this after making the PowerPoint, it sort of looks like a mugshot. It is not. What this is a exposition pass. So imagine, if you will, you're buying a Disney pass because you're going to go multiple times every year. And so you have your pass and you keep it in your wallet. In 1901, 1902, Charleston had its own World's Fair, a big Columbian exposition. And important Charlestonians, who's who of the business community, all went out and bought their own passes, and it had your little photograph on it. So that's Mr. Santo Sotilli, photographed in 1901. And he successfully started the first Cadillac dealership in the Lowcountry. And architecturally speaking, the family left its footprint. Now, mind you, they didn't build either of these houses, but both of these houses are still known as Sotilli houses today because the family owned them. So the one on the left is on College of Charleston campus. So those of you who are architecture nerds like me, you know that's not an Italian style house. It's Queen Anne Victorian. So he purchased it. That wasn't really his architectural choice. The one on the right was owned by Giovanni Sotilli, and I'll tell you a bit more about him on the next slide. But that house is actually a late 18th century home that had been Italianized not once, but twice. So an owner in the 1860s imported a bunch of beautiful Italian marble mantles and tried to update the house in Italianate style, which is Italian themed. When Giovanni Sotilli bought the house in 1905, he wanted it Italian Renaissance correct. So Giovanni, you see here after he was knighted, was a fascinating individual. He actually came here and was an accountant for one of the phosphate companies, and he saw firsthand how these Italians were being exploited. So he got out of the industry and he made good money in real estate and in liquor importation, and then eventually became the consul for South Carolina to Italy. And he was so good at the job that they expanded his district to include all of North Carolina and all of South Carolina. And when he renovated this house, 81 Rutledge Street, he not only turned it into an Italian Renaissance villa, he even put his initials, it's a little tough to see, but GS etched into the glass and forged into the ironwork. So that house was the consulate headquarters. It's where he entertained Italian dignitaries, ship captains, etc. And one of the things that's so fascinating about him is that he didn't forget about Italian exploitation. Once he became a consul and he had more of a political voice, he actively tried to bring to trial the padrones and the labor exploiters. And he managed to bring a couple railroad owners and some phosphate mine owners to court on behalf of the Italians. So he was kind of a good man in a lot of ways. Albert Sotilli, probably, I'd say the second, I mean, they're all important, but probably the second most famous, because Albert Sotilli managed Pastime Amusement Company. It's actually started by one of the other brothers, but Albert took that company and ran with it. And so what Pastime did, besides set up fun kind of amusement parks and hotels out on the Sea Islands, most importantly, they had the market cornered for early movie theaters. Multiple theaters in downtown Charleston. And I'm showing you a picture of just one, the Gloria, which is now Sotilli Theater, which is still in existence on King Street. So Charleston in the 1920s, 30s was a little bit of a stagnated place, yet you have these Italian immigrants, this new family coming in, bringing new businesses, first Cadillac dealership, all of these fun, flashy Art Deco theaters, bringing some new culture into the Lowcountry. So one other important Italian before we jump to the next theme, a pretty famous one, is Vincent Chico. And he's mostly famous because everybody likes stories about illegal liquor sales. Everybody likes somebody who manages to skirt the law. So Vincent Chico, like a lot of these Italian grocers and merchants, was a liquor wholesaler. But what he's most famous for is being the king of the blind tigers. And there's a big long tour guide story about how those work, but basically they're underground speakeasies. So during our various periods of prohibition, if you're drinking your own liquor, that's legal. You just can't be selling it. So here's one of his tokens, good for 5 cents, Chico's Cafe, and you can see a blind tiger stamped on the other side. So the story goes, you're not paying for the alcohol, you're paying for admittance to see the blind tiger do tricks and have a sandwich while they give you complimentary liquor. So that's the way he kind of skirted some of our Lowcountry anti-drinking laws. Pretty successful guy, just like the Sotillis. He worked his way up. He was a city council member, big real estate developer, and his descendants are still here in the Lowcountry. All right, so jumping into the present era. Once we get to the 20th century, we've got Italians, but we also have really our first generation of Italian Americans. And it's important to remember that the Lowcountry, like anywhere else in the United States, would have been a foreign land. And there absolutely would have been prejudice in the Lowcountry. So a lot of that was coming from our governor, Pitchfork Ben Tillman, who, it's fair to say, was a white supremacist, said some pretty horrible things about African Americans and Italians, and pretty much anybody who wasn't white and native born. So just like New York or Cleveland, there would have been a pressure to sort of Americanize, to start to fit in. So Giovanni Battista Sanguinetti, just one of hundreds of examples of Italians who changed his name to something that was a little bit more marketable and American sounding. So he was a laborer, he was a farm laborer who, as he was trying to work his way up out of that, decided that anglicizing his name would be a good political step. And even some of our most devout Italians, if that's a fair way to put it, they wanted to become Americans. That's why they were here. Some folks had aspirations to go home, others wanted to stay. So Carlo Moro, who typically was just known as Charlie Moro, he was the consul to Italy after Mr. Sotilli died. And even though he was the consul, he still applied to become an American. So this is his petition for naturalization. And unfortunately for him, when Mussolini rose to power, he passed a new law that anybody who had been naturalized could no longer be a consul. And so he had to renounce his job. And he stayed in the Lowcountry and was quoted in the newspapers about how upset he was when Italy joined on the Axis side during World War II. So he stayed here in the Lowcountry his whole life after immigrating. And of course, not to be stereotypical, but there was some really good Italian restaurants in the Lowcountry. So going along with groceries, it makes sense to have lunch counters, delis, and probably my favorite illustration that I found, both because there is a livery stable next door, which is another thing I'm trying to research, but also because this is the closest thing to a Little Italy I have found in the Lowcountry. This is a restaurant that used to be on Cumberland Street, and this is a circa 1920s photograph. So that's the earliest photo I can find of an Italian actual restaurant. The one on the top left, Labrasca's, is now gone, but would have been on Upper King Street. By all accounts, a good restaurant, but a more Americanized version of Italian, not to be confused with Il Cortile del Re, which sadly closed a few years ago, but was on King Street and was known for really good, authentic Italian food. And one kind of quick story, this is something that's sort of hidden in our Lowcountry history, but we have to remember Charleston's a maritime city. So during World War II, we reactivated all of our coastal installations like Fort Sumter and Fort Moultrie, and a couple German U-boats made it into the harbor, and we were always sort of concerned about invasion. And interestingly, we had a small little POW camp in what's now West Ashley. And it turns out there was dozens of Italian POWs who ended up there. And this was as the tides had turned and Italy was starting to cooperate more with the Allies. And so there's a fun Italian American named Tony Agresta. His family's still here in the Lowcountry. He was a coastie, and he also was a big band leader. So there you can see him leading his little orchestra during the World War II era. And he happened to be in his military Jeep at the Italian POW camp. And folks were speaking Italian and he could speak Italian. So he started having a discussion with these folks and they said, we really want to go to Charleston and see Betty Grable and go see a picture show. And so he actually took a bunch of them out of the camp and brought them downtown to the movies. And it probably would have been a Sotilli theater because they had the market cornered. So kind of a fun Italian experience during the war. And even though she was not truly Italian, she married one and became a princess. Princess Pignatelli that you see with her husband, Prince Pignatelli, was an important import to Charleston, very interested in historic preservation. So she not only bought various Lowcountry plantations to live in part-time, but she also helped save the Joseph Manigault house. You can see a little gas station and restroom in the yard, but she was able to help save that house. So pioneering preservationist that was able to buy back the house, and eventually Charleston Museum was able to scrape the Esso station. And so today, thanks in large part to her, we were able to save one of our important Neo-Palladian Charleston houses. So moving forward in time and getting ready to wind down and leave some Q&A time, wanted to mention Mr. Guida. mostly because he had such a long life. So born in 1880, and he came to the Lowcountry as a teen during that big diaspora period. And if you get a chance to purchase the book, please do support the Dante Alighieri Society. There is a long interview with him from the 1950s, later in his life. And back before Rainbow Row got fancy, for decades, the Guido family operated a grocery in what's now 105 East Bay, part of Rainbow Row. And his stories are fantastic about being a young immigrant and moving to Rainbow Row, which at the time would have been full of sailors, a very maritime, almost industrial area. And he talked about the transition and the preservation movement and sort of becoming an Italian American by the end. So jumping forward, probably our biggest or most recognizable Italian cultural contribution would be Spoleto Festival. And I have a great little interview, actually several, with folks who were kind enough to be interviewed. Lorenzo Muti, who was born in Spoleto, Italy, and now lives in the Lowcountry and is an important conductor. He no longer with us, but Giancarlo Minotti, one of the founders of Spoleto. Joseph Riley did a little interview for the book. So Spoleto Festival USA is just a counterpart to the older and original Spoleto Festival in Italy. And so Mr. Minotti had been interested in finding a way to have an American sister city, to have sort of a two-world Italian arts and architectural festival. And eventually he managed, through connections, to stumble on Charleston and decided that it would just be a perfect place. So he had been looking for decades, supposedly. And in 1977, we had our first Spoleto Festival USA, and it continues on both sides of the pond. And one of the important reasons that he picked the Lowcountry was because of Countess Alicia Spalding Pelosi. Not, obviously, look at the rest of her name, not Italian born, but she married into a very important Italian family. And she became really interested in Italian culture. And she's one of the folks who recommended Charleston as a good counterpoint to Spoleto. And the early days of the festival, obviously, it's not just Italian productions. It's interested in culture and arts from the world over. But in the early days, all of the interviewees spoke about how small and fun and how much of a family these early festivals were, where, Miss Pelosi would put up young performers from Spoleto, Italy in her own home. And it was just almost like a cultural exchange program. And it's grown in size and prowess, which is great. But we have to remember that in 1977, Charleston didn't have a lot of hotels and it didn't really have that many tourists. So it took a major vision from Mayor Joe Riley during his first term back in the 70s, and Mr. Minotti and Ted Stern over at College of Charleston to really bring this festival to reality. And there's a great interview in the book with Nigel Redden, who is about to retire as general director. But his interview was really fun because he interned in Italy, in Spoleto, as a young college student. And so he got a chance to see both sides of the festival and then spent most of his adult professional life leading the American version. So I think it's just great how those connections between the two places continue. So bringing it full circle, what are Italian Americans up to today? Well, obviously the Chicos and the Sottiles, all of those families left large legacies, as did all of the sadly faceless Italian immigrants who would have labored in phosphate mines and on farms. But I want to mention just quickly, and I updated this, the Albert Sotilli Foundation still exists, and all of those Sotilli brothers, married Americans, married Irish, married Italians, and the family has flourished, and they continue to travel back to Italy for family reunions. But just a few years ago, College of Charleston did a great little article about two of Albert's granddaughters, Joyce Carolyn Long Darby and Mary Ellen Long Way. Unfortunately, Miss Darby passed away just less than a month ago in May. So we're sad that she's no longer with us. But this photograph coincides with the renovation of one of the Sotilli theaters at College of Charleston. And this was a great success story because all of these great Italian murals had been painted over, and you can see pegboard holes in it. And a few years ago, when the college was renovating the building, they found the original artwork almost by accident. And all of that has been brought back to life. So you can still see a couple of these theaters almost as they appeared when the Sottiles first opened them. And then we'd be remiss if we didn't mention that Charleston, even though we're a small city, from the beginning in the colonial period to the present, we really managed to punch above our weight culturally. And I think part of it is the Lowcountry is beautiful, hot, but beautiful. And we've always been a maritime cosmopolitan city. But what attracts most of the important Italians to the Lowcountry today now is our important academic institutions. Medical University of South Carolina, College of Charleston, and of course our global shipping with like Mediterranean Shipping Company, which has a base in Mount Pleasant today, and Boeing and aeronautics. So much like our first Italians who came in the colonial period were very culturally gifted, a lot of the Italians who were lucky enough to pick Charleston today are picking it because we continue to have important global business connections. So to mention a few of them very quickly, Dr. Alessandra Matelli, who is a cancer researcher, was kind enough to do an interview for the book. There is Donatella Capoletti and her husband, Mr. Della Porta, in front of their fantastic store, the Hidden Count Ship. So if you've never been and you want to buy a book, go there. They specialize in importing beautiful handmade Italian goods. So no screen printed rainbow row mugs, beautiful pieces of art brought to the Lowcountry to keep Italian culture alive. And of course, Professor Dr. Giovanna Deluca, who not only teaches at College of Charleston, but founded the Italian Cinema Festival that takes place every year. Enzo Queso, important in the aviation industry, Laura and Zaza Zanatti, keeping proper Italian pizza alive in the Lowcountry. And that's just 5 quick ones. And the book has maybe 12 essays from important current Italians. And again, this is the tip of the iceberg. Hopefully people will be excited and they'll pick up the research and they'll uncover more of these stories going back 300 years. So I'm awful and I always go 10 minutes longer than I mean to because I get excited, but we'll do some Q&A. Want to mention again, thank you to the Dante Alighieri Society for sponsoring and creating the book. Thank you to Donatella for helping track down all of those interviews from the current Italians. And thank you, of course, to Charleston Library Society for hosting this evening. So I will cease and see if there are any questions that came in. Sorry, I went long.
No need to apologize to us. That was a fantastic lecture once again. We have a few questions that have come in, and I just want to say that like you were so thorough that covered a lot, but you've also like raised a lot of really good questions. One of the questions that came in is how did you like get oh, so did you hear any, like, how did you get a sense of like what was happening on the Grand Tour when they connected, when people would go over to Italy and they would see these dig sites? Were you reviewing diaries and journals? Like, how did you get a sense of what that may have felt like for those people?
Great question. So most of them both wrote letters back to family here in the Lowcountry, and some of them also kept travel journals if you will, like travel diaries. And there was a really good, this is just a quick one that comes to mind, a really good letter that one of the Izard Middleton women sent back home to a sister here in the Lowcountry, something to words can't describe. She was more eloquent than me, I'm paraphrasing here, but words can't describe the impact of seeing the master works in the museums in person. Because people, when they go on these grand tours, some of them would try and purchase actual masterpieces, and others would hire young artists to do their own version, smaller ones that they could send home. So, there's like 500 copies of the Madonna, that are all over the place. And so she basically said, oh, well, words can't describe seeing the originals. They're just better, they're sharper, they're richer. And there are some much longer than I put in the book, really good long quotes in Maury McInnes's works, because she was able to pull up a lot of the manuscripts, and some of them that I'm not good enough at translating. Some of them from Mr. Alan Smith were in French, because he stayed in Italy and then he, I think, ended up dying in Paris. And so some of his letters aren't in English. And so she was good enough to translate those. And then I stole the English translation. And one of the other things that they spoke about was it's kind of sad, but almost like Northerners coming here in the 20s, buying up architectural features to mail back home. They knew that there was a lot of Italian families who had large estates and more property than they could keep up with. And so they had Italian art merchants who would help line up tours with those, lesser nobility's houses, and they would ask if they could purchase pieces and bring them home. So it's kind of sad in that regard, but it's nice that we have a catalog of that stuff and that some of it survived and ended up here in the Lowcountry. And Alan Smith talked a good bit about the digs, and he mentions who his guides are by name. So European tourists would have been at those sites as well, but keep in mind, just a quick example, and this is Greek, so it's not as applicable, but the Stewart and Rivette architectural pattern book, Antiquities of Athens, is some English dudes who go to Athens when it's under the Ottoman Empire, not easy to get to, and they try and do drawings of the ancient ruins. And a lot of Roman ruins would have been in parts of Europe that weren't accessible to Americans and Europeans. So by that federal period, not only is travel getting a little easier, but parts of, thanks to Napoleon, Egypt, where there's cool Roman ruins, are becoming accessible. So they really would have been kind of cultural explorers in a way.
That's it makes me think a lot about like the Vedute de Roma, the Piranesi that we have in the collection, and just the kind of unearthing of these giant columns and these, the relics of the past. We have a couple questions from the audience, and we haven't done this in Zoom before, but I'm going to give it a shot. We're gonna take the two hands that are raised right now, and then we're gonna close up for the evening, just because we don't want to go too far over. But first things first, the link for this evening's events book has been shared in the chat, and so you could directly click on that and purchase it through our awesome independent on-campus bookstore that we collaborate with, Buxton Books. And I have two questions, and I'm going to start with Marinella. I'm going to go ahead and ask you to unmute.
Thank you, and I apologize. I couldn't figure out how to send you a question, so that I'll be brief. First of all, thank you, Christina, because that was a beautiful excursus on the history of the people that came from my country. I'm Italian, born and raised there, but I wanted to tell you that I enjoyed very much your presentation, because I just taught a class about the Grand Tour to Italy, and I brought my students to the Aiken House, and we saw the artifacts and everything else. And I wanted your opinion about, you mentioned, of course, Palladian style and taken by the British. did you, during your research, did you run into the fact that the British, and as a consequence, the American as well, rejected the Baroque style because it was mostly churches ornated for the Pope and the papacy, and therefore they bounded to Palladium because he was more modern and was not religious building. Did you run into anything like that?
Absolutely. So they're not explicitly in Charleston records, although again, tip of the iceberg. I hope some master's student takes it and runs with it, because I'm sure there's more to be unearthed. But absolutely. So anything that was too papist or too Catholic would have been unpopular. So Baroque architecture is never really embraced in the Lowcountry. Baroque ironwork shows up and a little bit of Baroque paper mache and plaster work, but they tend to only be in the most avant-garde private houses. Palladio was kind of safer, as it were, because it's pre-Protestant Reformation, it's pre-Counter-Reformation. And I think one of the reasons even modernists like Palladio's work is it's so grand but understated. You know, to use a modern parlance, it's almost minimalist. It's not gaudy in any way. And I like Baroque stuff, but we've all seen it's an intense experience, which is the point in a church or a palace, but that would have been very decidedly unpopular with the British. And as you mentioned, a lot of that is because of that utter dislike of anything that's too Catholic. So that I know of, there aren't any Charleston architects who are trying to push that envelope and do more avant-garde Baroque. They're sticking with the Neo-Palladians. They're sticking with, ancient classical details. They're not breaking that English approved guidebook, if you will.
Christina, you just totally shown your own light on how much information you have on preservation and architecture. And, I think that kind of also speaks to the other books you have in your canon. We also have another hand up from Michael. I'm going to go ahead and ask you to unmute.
Hi, Christina. You, as the grandson of an Italian immigrant who came to Charleston in 1898, you have almost brought me to tears with this presentation. It is just amazing. I have learned more in the past hour about Italians in Charleston than in my entire life, and I've spent much of my life here. So I thank you very much, really, at the bottom of my heart. What you really interested me in is when you and I had never made this connection in my life between, at the end of slavery, how slavery was replaced by other immigrants, and that started me thinking about racism in the Lowcountry with Italians. I would like to think that Italian racism in the Lowcountry was no better or worse than in the rest of the country, but I almost feel like it was a more genteel, gentle place where my forebears flourished. My grandfather never talked about racism that much, and he had a very successful career and raised a family. And so I wonder if you could speak to that. Do you think the question is, do you think Italians were better treated in Charleston and more welcome here than other parts of the United States in those early days of heinous racism?
Yeah, a great question. And I think heinous racism is a really good way to put it. I think one thing that would have worked in their favor is there was never such a large influx for there to be a paranoia. If you think about 16 million people from Italy coming in a 40-year time period, I mean, it legit leads to an anti-immigration quota, in 1921, where only a certain percentage of the peak amount of people who came from any country outside of foreign country could come into the US. And so almost all of us who are, Sicilian, Italian, I'm half Slovenian, everybody came in that same little window, and then the doors literally start closing, and it becomes much harder to get permission to come here. You know, the Ellis Island experience, it starts to go away. And I think it would have in some ways been a more inviting city, because it's not it's got a reputation for that. People in the Lowcountry tend to be hospitable people. Secondly, it's awful but true that African Americans have always been at the very bottom of the social totem pole, and Italians, whilst not able to speak English, can identify as white, depending who you ask, because Pitchfork Ben Tillman considered swarthy Southern Europeans not to be white. His words, not mine. So this kind of predates the Italians showing up, but there was a really messed up political movement some of you are probably familiar with in the 1850s called the Know Nothing movement, and it was a giant anti-immigration party. And they were a nativist party. They just know people who aren't from here come here, and there was a boom of that in the Lowcountry. There was a fear of too many Irish coming here, partially because they were Catholic. And we kind of forget that Irish coming here in the potato famine, a lot of them couldn't speak English yet, you know? And so Italians and Irish alike, this is the way they would put it, even though it sounds awful. We're always going to be more white than African Americans. So for that upsetting reason, they might have been more welcomed. It's also a maritime city. So the first Italians who came, they're ship captains, you know, they're fishermen. And so people who lived in rural upstate would have probably been pretty paranoid about 500 Italians working on a farm. But in the Lowcountry, close to the city, they would have been more used to different languages being heard on the street. And I think one thing that speaks to them being accepted is how many of their families stayed in the Lowcountry instead of saying, I am out, I'm going to New York City where there's more of my people. I mean, a lot of them, like your family, they chose to stay, which has to say something about how they were received here.
Christina, thank you for addressing that question. It was an excellent question and really well put. We want to thank everybody for joining us tonight. Christina, you did a lovely job, and you're, as I said, you're a treasure, and your knowledge is so well received. And we hope that anybody who's at this event tonight goes ahead and purchases this book. I cannot wait to just finish reading it. You did a fantastic job, and thank you all for being here tonight. We've loved having you, and I hope that you have a wonderful rest of your night.
May I say one thing before you guys sign out, for anybody who's still here? Firstly, Marinella, if you ever teach that class again, please let me know, because I really want to audit it. Yeah, yes. I wish I knew how to type stuff on here, and I don't. Google me, you'll find it right away, because I would love to take your class. Secondly, I think Mr. Fritz might have signed off, but if not, there's a free source you can download from the interwebs. I did a National Register nomination for 81 Rutledge, which is the Sottiles house. And there's a big long biography of Giovanni Sotilli in it, but I put a lot of information in there about the anti-Italian racist rhetoric from Ben Tillman, and a whole lot more about the Italian phosphate miners than are in this book. So you can download, if you just Google Giovanni Sotilli house, the register form will come right up. You can download it for free, and it's got some extra information should you want a fun read with no pictures to accompany your book. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christina. You did a wonderful job, and we look forward to having you back, and hopefully you'll be a part 2.
Here's hoping. Thanks so much, y'all.
Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful night.